Hello, guys and gals, and this is part 10 of the Provensen Book of Fairy Tales, and there are only 2 stories left after this one, because there are 12 stories total, and we are on number 10, so I'm going to put that to the side. Now, what we are going to do now is, in the last one we read 3 Wishes by Barbara Leone Picard, I believe it was, right there, Barbara Leone Picard, and that was a really good story. We will next be reading The Swan Maiden by Howard Pyle. I don't know if that's in relation to Gomer Pyle or not, but hey, I don't know. Anyways, I would just want to add that this is the Provensen Book of Fairy Tales is compiled, and the illustrations are by Alice and Martin Provensen. I do have to throw it out there, and this book is copyright 1971, I believe. But anyway, let's dive right into the story. By Howard Pyle. Once there was a king who had a pear tree which bore 24 golden pears. Every day he went to the garden and counted them to see that none were missing. But one morning he found that a pear had been taken during the night and was troubled and vexed to the heart of the pear tree, for the pear tree was very dear to him. Now the king had 3 sons, and so he called the eldest prince to him. "See," said he, "if you will watch my pear tree tonight, and will find me the thief who stole the pear, you shall have half my kingdom now, and the whole of it when I am gone." You can guess how the prince was. The prince was tickled at this. Oh yes, he would watch the tree, and if the thief should come, he should not get away again so easily. Well, that night he sat down beside the tree with his gun across his knee and to wait for the coming of the thief. He waited, and still he saw not as much as a thread or a hair. But about the middle of the night there came the very prettiest music his ears had ever heard, and before he knew what he was about, he was asleep and snoring until the little leaves shook up in the tree. When the morning came and he awoke, another pear was gone, and he could tell no more about it than the man in the moon. The next night, the second son set out to watch the pear tree, but he fared no better than the first. About midnight came the music, and in a little while he was snoring till the stones rattled. When the morning came, another pear was gone, and he had no more to tell about it than his brother. The third night it was the turn of the youngest son, and he was more clever than the others, for when the evening came he stuffed his ears full of wax, so that he was deaf as a post. About midnight, when the music came, he heard nothing of it, and so he stayed wide awake. And after the music had ended, he took the wax out of his ears, so that he might listen for the coming of the thief. Presently there was a loud clapping and rattling, and a white swan flew overhead and lit on the pear tree above him. He began picking at one of the pears, and then the prince raised his gun to shoot at it. But when he looked along the barrel, it was not a swan that he saw up in the pear tree, but the prettiest girl he had ever seen. So I guess that there's the sun sleeping, and then there's... Okay. "Don't shoot me, king's son. Don't shoot me," cried she. The prince had no thought of shooting her, for he had never seen such a beautiful maiden in all of his days. "Very well," he said. "I will not shoot you, but if I spare your life, will you promise to be my sweetheart and to marry me?" That may be as may be. That may be as may be," said the Swan Maiden. "For listen, I serve the witch with 3 eyes. She lives on the glass hill that lies beyond the 7 high mountains, the 7 deep valleys, and the 7 wide rivers. Are you man enough to go that far?" "Oh, yes," said the prince. "I am man enough for that, and more, too." "That is good," said the Swan Maiden. And thereupon she jumped down from the pear tree to the earth. Then she became a swan again, and bade the king's son to mount upon her back at the root of her wings. When he had done as she had told him, she sprang into the air and flew away, bearing him with her. On flew the swan, and on until by and by she said, "What do you see, king's son?" "I see the gray sky above me and the dark earth below me, but nothing else," he said. After they flew on and on again, until at last the Swan Maiden said, "What do you see now, king's son?" "I see the gray sky above me and the dark earth below me, but nothing else." So once more they flew on until the Swan Maiden said for the third time, "What do you see now, king's son?" By this time the prince said, "I see the gray sky above me and the dark earth below me, and over yonder is a glass hill, on which is a house that shines like fire." "That is where the witch with 3 eyes lives," said the maiden. "And now, listen. When she asks you what it is that you came for, ask her to give you the one who draws the water and builds the fire, for that is myself." So when they had come to the top of the hill of glass, the king's son stepped down onto the ground. The swan flew over the roof. Rap, tap, tap. He knocked on the door, and the old witch herself opened it. "What do you want here?" said she. "I want the one who draws the water and builds the fire," said the prince. At this the old witch scowled until her eyebrows met. "Very well," said she. "You shall have what you want, if you can clean my stables tomorrow, between the rise and the set of the sun. But I tell you plainly, if you fail in the doing, you shall be torn to pieces, body and bones." Ouch, that sounds painful. The prince was not to be scared away with empty words, so the next morning the old witch came and took him to the stables where he was to do the task. There stood more than 100 cattle, and the stables had not been cleaned for at least 10 long years. "There's your work," said the old witch, and then she left him. Well, the king's son set to work with fork and broom, and might and main, but prut he might as well have tried to bail out the great oceans with a bucket. At noontide, who should come to the stables but the Swan Maiden herself? "When one is tired, one should rest for a while," she said. "Come and lay your head in my lap." The prince was glad enough to do as she said, for nothing was to be gained by working at that task. So he laid his head in her lap, and she combed his hair with a golden comb, till he fell fast asleep. When he awoke, the Swan Maiden was gone, and the sun was setting, and the stable was as clean as a plate. Presently he heard the old witch coming, so up he jumped and began clearing away straw here and a speck there, just as though he were finishing the work. "You never did this by yourself," said the old witch, and her brows grew as black as a thunderstorm. "That may be so, and that may not be so," said the king's son. But you lent no hand to help. So now may I have the one who builds the fire and draws the water." At that the old witch shook her head. "No," she said, "there is more to be done yet before you can have what you ask for." No, she said, "there is more to be done yet before you can have what you ask for. If you can thatch the roof of the stable with bird feathers, no two of which shall be of the same color, and can do it between the rise and set of the sun tomorrow, then you shall have your sweetheart and welcome. But if you fail, your bones shall be ground into fine as malt in the mill." That suited the king's son well enough, so at sunrise he rose and went into the fields with his gun. But if there were birds to be shot, it was few of them that he saw. For at noontime he had but 2, and they were both the same color. At that time, who should come to him but the Swan Maiden? "One should not tramp all day, and never a bit of rest," said she. "Come lay your head in my lap a while." The prince did as she bade him, and the Swan Maiden again combed his hair with the golden comb until he fell asleep. When he awoke, the sun was setting, and the work was done. He heard the old witch coming, so up he jumped to the roof of the stable and began laying feather here and feather there, for all the world as through though he had just finished the task. You never did this work alone, said the old witch. That may be so, and it may not be so, said the prince. All the same, it was none of your doing. So now may I have the one who draws the water and builds the fire. But the witch shook her head no. This time there is still another task to do before that. Over yonder is a fir tree. On the tree is a crow's nest, and in that nest are 3 eggs. If you can harry that nest tomorrow, between the rise and the setting of the sun, neither break nor leaving a single egg, you shall have that for which you ask. That suited the prince. The next morning, at the rising of the sun, he started off to find the fir tree, and there was no trouble in the finding, I can tell you, for it was more than 100 feet high and as smooth as glass from root to tip. As for climbing, it might as well he might as well have tried to climb a moonbeam, for in spite of all his trying, he did nothing but slip and slip. By and by came the Swan Maiden, and she had come before. Do you climb the fir tree? Said she. None too well, said the king's son. Then I shall help you in a hard task. She let down the braids of her golden hair so that it hung down all about her and upon the ground, and then she began singing to the wind. She sang, and by and by the wind began to blow. And catching up the maiden's hair, carried it to the top of the fir tree, and there tied it to the branches. So the prince climbed the hair, and so reached the nest. There was the 3 eggs. He gathered them, and then he came down, as he had gone up. After that the wind came again, and loosed the maiden's hair from the branches, and she bound it up as before. Now listen, said she to the prince. When the old witch asks you for the 3 crow's eggs which you have gathered, tell her that they belong to the one who found them. She will not be able to take them from you, and they are worth something, I can tell you. At sunset, the old witch came hobbling along, and there sat the prince at the foot of the fir tree. Have you gathered the crow's eggs? Said she. Yes, said the prince. Here they are in my handkerchief, and now may I have the one who draws the water and builds the fire? Yes, said the old witch. You may have her. Only give me my crow's eggs. No, said the prince. The crow's eggs are none of yours, for they belong to him who gathered them. Then the old witch found that she was not to get her crow's eggs in that way. She tried another, and began using words as sweet as honey. Come, there should be no hard feelings between us, she said. You have served me faithfully, and before you go home with what you came for, you should have a good supper. So she brought the prince into the house, and then she left him while she went to put the pot on the fire, and to sharpen the bread knife on the stone doorstep. While the prince sat waiting for the witch, there came a tap at the door, and who should it be but the Swan Maiden? Come, she said, and bring the 3 eggs with you, for the knife that the old witch is sharpening is for you, and so is the great pot on the fire, for she means to pick your bones in the morning. She led the prince down into the kitchen, and there they made a figure out of honey. They made a figure out of honey and barley meal, so that it was all soft and sticky. Then the maiden dressed the figure in her own clothes and set it in the chimney corner by the fire. After that was done, she became a swan again, and taking the prince upon her back, she flew away over the hills. As for the old witch, she sat on the stony doorstep sharpening her knife. By and by she came in, and looked as she might, there was no prince to be found. Then, if anybody was ever in a rage, it was the old witch. Off she went, storming and fuming, until she came into the kitchen. there sat the woman of honey and barley meal, beside the fire, dressed in the maiden's clothes. And the old woman thought that it was the girl herself. Where is your sweetheart? She said. But to this the woman of honey and barley meal answered never a word. How now, are you dumb? Cried the old witch. I will see whether I cannot bring speech from your lips. She raised her hand, slap. She struck. Oh no, slap she struck, and so hard was the blow that her hand stuck fast to the honey and barley meal. What? cried she. Will you hold me? Slap. She struck with the other hand, and it too stuck fast. So there she was, and for all I know, she is sticking to the woman of honey and barley meal to this day. Okay. As for the Swan Maiden and the prince, they flew over the 7 high mountains, the 7 deep valleys, and the 7 wide rivers until they came near the prince's home again. The Swan Maiden lit in a great wide field, and there she told the prince to break open one of the crow's eggs. The prince did as she bade him, and what should she find but the most beautiful little palace, all of pure gold and silver. He set the palace on the ground, and it grew and grew and grew until it covered as much ground as 7 large barns. Then the Swan Maiden told him to break another egg, and he did, and as she said, and what should come out of it but such a great herd of cows and sheep that they covered the meadow far and near. The Swan Maiden told him to break the 3rd egg, and out of it came scores and scores of servants, all dressed in gold and silver uniforms. That morning, when the king looked out of his bedroom window, there stood the splendid castle of silver and gold. Then he called all of his people together, and they rode over to see what it meant. On the way they met such herds of fat sheep and cattle that the king had never seen the like of in all of his life before. And when he came to the fine castle, there were 2 rows of servants dressed in silver and gold, ready to meet him. But when he came to the door of the castle, there stood the prince himself. Then there was joy and rejoicing, you may be sure. Only the 2 elder brothers looked down in the mouth, for since the young prince had found the thief who stole the golden pears, their father's kingdom was not for them. But the prince soon set their minds at rest on the score for which he had enough and more than enough of his own. After that, the prince and the Swan Maiden were married in a grand wedding. After that, the prince and the Swan Maiden were married, and a grand wedding they had of it, with music and fiddles and kettle drums and plenty to eat and to drink, and they all lived happily ever after. That was the Swan Maiden, I believe. What was the name of this one? The Swan Maiden by Howard Pyle. Okay, in the next one, we will be reading The Dreamer by Catherine Pyle. What if they're related? That's cool. But that will be for another time. This has been a reading from the Provensen Book of Fairy Tales. It is a compilation of stories that were compiled by Alice and Martin Provensen, and they also did all the artwork in the book, which is awesome. If you like this content, make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also, if you want to support me in any way, all that information will be in the description below. And as always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.